AAA and the university, I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Mawina people and the Palawa people. This land and their commitment to it and their understanding of it and the lessons that we can learn from them about it are critical as we move forward as a community. I think I pay respect to them, those who've survived, those who've left a legacy, and those who are yet to come. It's fairly crucial in all of the discussions that we have that we recognise that we have a significant debt to pay because this country was never ceded and is still a colonial country. Okay, on behalf of the AAA, in terms of tonight's event, I'm really happy to hand over to Bruno Aki, who's our council member and who's going to chair tonight's program on our behalf. This is part of making sure that AAA maintains a presence across disciplines, and the presence here tonight of key people has been really important for that. And the fact that Jeff and Bruno have actually helped us have Don here is really exciting. I think it's really good. So and we love the collaboration with IMAS and the law school. So I'd like to pass over to Bruno now. When you leave, up where the cheese and wine was, there are membership forms for AAA if anyone wants to join. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim. So good evening, everyone. Welcome to this public lecture co-hosted by the Australian Institute of International Affairs, Tasmanian branch, and the law school here at the University of Tasmania. So tonight we have a very interesting and relevant topic for the security of the region, Australia, and also Tasmania. So as you all know, we will be discussing this trilateral security, maybe strategic, military partnership between Australia, the United Kingdom, and the US for the Indo-Pacific region, known as AUKUS, under international law. Yes? And tonight we have the great pleasure to have with us Professor Donald Rothwell, who came from Canberra to visit our beautiful island. So thank you, Professor, for joining us tonight. Yes, and for those who doesn't know, Don is Professor of International Law at the College of Law of the Australian National University in Canberra, and his research has a specific focus on law of the sea, polar law, and the implementation of international law within Australia, as reflected in more than 200 publications, including a third edition of his leading work on the international law of the sea with our also very good colleague, Tim Stevens. Yeah? And also he has recently published another very interesting book on islands and international law. So I highly recommend it to get a copy of that excellent book. Don also has acted as a consultant and legal advisor to the Australian government and various international organizations on several occasions. And as you all probably know, he's a regular media commentator on international law issues. Tonight, Don will discuss some legal issues that have been raised in relation to AUKUS that may be problematic for Australia and address possible Australian responses to these legal issues. So Don will present for 40 minutes, and then we will have the remaining 20 minutes for question and answers. So again, thank you, Don, for joining us tonight. So you have the floor.
Thank you, Bruno, for that very generous introduction, and it's a great pleasure to be here at the University of Tasmania with some old and new friends, so to speak, to talk about an issue through a legal lens, but which clearly has immense strategic political and international relations dimensions for Australia. Apropos my comments, I'm very much going to be looking at this from a legal perspective, but in Q&A, no doubt we'll be able to look at broader issues. I have this indelible memory in my mind about a morning in September 2021. Canberra was in lockdown at the time. I was working from home, and a breathless Fran Kelly was talking to my ANU colleague, Emeritus Professor Hugh White, about this breaking story about AUKUS, in which the Australian media was trying to get a handle on what had just been announced. And Hugh White, the preeminent expert on this issue, likewise was trying to get an understanding of what all of this meant in terms of the announcement that was coming out of Parliament House in Canberra, the White House and Downing Street. And as we slowly learned over coming weeks and months, AUKUS had significant ramifications at multiple different levels, and it created turmoil and turbulence in terms of some of Australia's bilateral relations, not excluding the French, of course. So the immediate issue becomes what arises from AUKUS.
Someone lower the lights a little bit so the screen is not so.
That's a good idea. Can Don see?
I can see, thank you. Obviously, September 21 is the starting point for an understanding of AUKUS, and as I indicated, the broad framework for an understanding of AUKUS was sketched out at that particular time. And then I guess there were issues arising quite naturally with a change of government in Australia and also a change in Prime Minister in the United Kingdom. And if many of you, I suspect, may have engaged in the ABC documentary series Nemesis, in which the then Prime Minister Scott Morrison, who launched AUKUS, spoke in fairly graphic detail about some aspects of how the AUKUS deal was reached between himself, Joe Biden, and Boris Johnson. So there were quite naturally, I think, issues arising in terms of how AUKUS might be seen by subsequent administrations in Downing Street and also in Canberra. But notwithstanding, legitimate, I think, question marks about how a Labor government might react to AUKUS. It was fairly clear early on that there was going to be a level of bipartisan support towards it, and that certainly has been achieved whilst the Albanese government has transitioned to office. Now, we at the moment are in this interesting phase in terms of lots of different AUKUS stories and dimensions coming out on a daily basis. I can reveal to you that tomorrow's front page of The Australian will read as follows: Aussie firms at risk of being crushed by AUKUS. Now, I don't give you that scoop because I've written that piece, but rather because I've got a feed in terms of what the Australian's front page is occurring in advance each day. But it just gives you a sense of the alarm that's continued to be raised and the debate and the discourse that exists nationally within Australia with respect to AUKUS. So my goal this evening is just to remind you of some of the key components of AUKUS, so we're all on the same page, and then to look at two particular legal issues arising from that. Now, I'm afraid it has become too dark for me, but we'll see how we go. I'm good. I'm good. Actually, can we just, can you just get a bit of light on that?
We had a setting, I remember a while ago, that was nice compromise.
Does that little red one come up? Yeah. It should come up. It's not coming up. There should be a setting with lighting.
There you go.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you. Right. So this is a sort of a broad brush in terms of what AUKUS encompasses. And whilst there has been an appropriate focus on the building of AUKUS submarines, technically known as SSN AUKUS in Australia and in the United Kingdom. Of course, a critical component of the initial phase of Australia acquiring nuclear-propelled submarines will be the transfer to Australia, the sale to Australia of 3 Virginia-class submarines at a date to be determined sometimes later in this decade. So in terms of the build of the submarines, you can see the current numbers that are being discussed, though there's some suggestion that those numbers might change or modify over a period of time. It's also an important point to note that under the expectations associated with AUKUS that there will be a rotational presence of US and UK submarines in and out of Australia, but principally HMAS Sterling. And of course, these are the key components of Pillar 1 of AUKUS. There's, of course, a Pillar 2 of AUKUS, which engages additional levels of defence cooperation and engagement at a high-tech level, at perhaps a cyber level. So this, if you like, is the hardware dimension of AUKUS in terms of submarines, but there are other significant dimensions of AUKUS that have been constantly in debate and discussion. And interestingly, that is seeing the emergence of debate and discussion about other states engaging in Pillar 2 of AUKUS. And at the moment, Japan, Canada, and New Zealand are also in the frame for joining the 3rd pillar of AUKUS. So AUKUS will grow potentially over a period of time, providing that there's core commitment amongst the 3 key states which have established the level of defence cooperation and engagement. Whether the acronym will change, I think, is very doubtful. So in terms of Australia's initial acquisition of submarines, this is the Virginia-class attack submarine, which Australia may well acquire under the first phase of AUKUS prior to the building of the actual SSN AUKUS submarines. Those of you who have been following some of the debate and discourse within the United States will be aware of the fact that there have been delays in terms of the production of these submarines coming out of the United States. And so questions have been raised within the Biden administration and indeed amongst defence analysts as to whether or not US production with respect to these submarines will be adequate to meet the type of commitments that the United States might need to meet in terms of its AUKUS obligations. So I think that just emphasises that there's some level of fluidity around this. So the Virginia-class submarines are an existing submarine that's been built and designed, in which the United States has been operating some period of time. We now move to the distinctive nuclear-propelled submarine that will be a joint US-UK design with Australian build capacity, but out of which the nuclear reactor capacity will be coming from the United States. So truly a tripartite engagement, the design of a brand new submarine class. And so you get a sense here in terms of the speculation as to where the SSN AUKUS type level submarine might eventually evolve over a period of time. I don't profess to have enormous technological expertise on these issues, but I guess the point is that there's some level of fluidity around all of the design dimensions associated with these submarines for the time being. But what is absolutely certain is the following. These submarines will be nuclear propelled and they will not be nuclear armed. And that moves us to perhaps the critical questions. So in terms of the global state of nuclear-powered submarines, and I'm not, as I've indicated, a scholar with any particular expertise on this, so I'm just taking material off reputable, reliable sources. You can see that this is the current state in terms of the global possession of nuclear-powered submarines. So the United States is way out in front. Russia, China, the United Kingdom, though the United Kingdom's obviously in a significant build capacity. France also has capacity, and there's speculation, but not yet completely confirmed, about the ability of other states to build or whether or not other states are actually operating nuclear-powered submarines at this point in time. So with that sort of background, I want to move to the legal analysis. So a fundamental basis upon which AUKUS operates is this. It solely is framed around the freedom of navigation. It's framed around an assumption on the part of Australia and its partners that AUKUS submarines will be able to freely operate within the world's oceans. So the legal foundation, the operational principle upon which AUKUS rests is the freedom of navigation of military vessels and in particular of submarines. Now, as an aside, I have spent much of the last few days talking about Hobart. And in particular, I've been speaking about HMAS Hobart. And the incident involving HMAS Hobart in the Yellow Sea has in fact directly raised and highlighted issues with respect to the freedom of navigation. And the reason why I raise this is that the debate and discourse between Australia and China over the activities concerning the HMAS Hobart and the launching by HMAS Hobart of a Seahawk helicopter have highlighted different perspectives and views as to what types of vessels can legitimately engage in the freedom of navigation. The Australian position, as I understand it, though there's some uncertainty as to where exactly the HMAS Hobart was operating in the Yellow Sea, was that Hobart was operating in international waters within the Yellow Sea. Now, for the international lawyers amongst us, the term international waters is meaningless. We cannot find the term international waters referred to in the Constitution of the Oceans, which is the 1982 UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. So what does this term international waters mean? At one level, it could extend to the high seas. And the high seas at one level is an area that sits 200 nautical miles off the coastline. It sits beyond the exclusive economic zone. Another interpretation is international waters commences 13 nautical miles offshore beyond the edge of the territorial sea. So you'll immediately appreciate that there's a vast level of different views and possible interpretations as to what may constitute international waters. And the Australian Department of Defence has refused to give any additional details as to where HMAS Hobart was operating in the Yellow Sea. China's position would appear to be, on the basis of the information that's been put into the public domain, is that the Hobart was certainly not operating within China's territorial sea. So I think we can set that aside. But China does certainly seem to have put forward the position that the Hobart, or at least the helicopter launched from Hobart, was operating very close to China's territorial sea. So if at a minimum we say that these activities were occurring within the Chinese exclusive economic zone, Well, what's China's position then in terms of military activities within its exclusive economic zone? Now, we need to be clear, we're not talking about the South China Sea, which has its own distinctive dynamics. We're talking about the Yellow Sea, which is a less contested area, but an area over which China, North Korea, and South Korea all have competing maritime claims. But China certainly has a legitimate claim to an exclusive economic zone within the Yellow Sea. So what's China's position then in terms of military activities occurring within its exclusive economic zone? And that's the crunch point here. Because at one level, Australia would say, well, Australia can conduct military operations within the exclusive economic zone of China, New Zealand, Indonesia, India, because that's what the Law of the Sea Convention says. But there are some states which take the view that no, you cannot undertake active military operations within the exclusive economic zone of our state. And here we may need to make a distinction between the mere passage or the mere transit of a vessel or the underwater submergence of a submarine, as opposed to a vessel which is actively engaged in military operations, such as launching a Seahawk helicopter and seeking to enforce UN Security Council resolutions. So I hope I'm trying to get to the nub of the issue here, and that is differing interpretations of what may well be the freedom of navigation within different maritime zones. And whilst China is in the minority of states in terms of taking this very expansive view as to what China can control in terms of military activities within its EEZ, there is a growing group of states, of which India is another state. And of course, India is a group of the Quad, which Australia also has defence and security relationships, who also object to foreign militaries conducting military naval operations within their exclusive economic zone. So I guess I'm trying to raise with you this evening whether or not the fundamental premise upon which AUKUS is based, the freedom of navigation, a right which Western nations, Western militaries, Western naval powers, including Australia, have fundamentally pushed for decades, might actually be beginning to have a question mark beside it because of the position that certain states are taking in terms of interpreting and applying these issues. So this really just sort of encapsulates the key navigational rights and freedoms that exist within various bodies of water. The right of innocent passage applies within the 12 nautical mile territorial sea. The right of transit passage applies within international straits, of which Bass Strait is an example. The Straits of Singapore and Malacca are another strait which falls into that category. There are also distinctive navigational rights that exist within archipelagic waters, of which the waters of Indonesia and the Philippines fall into that category. So the base level standard interpretation in terms of navigational rights and freedoms for submarines is that submarines can enjoy all of these rights because that's the standard interpretation that exists under the Law of the Sea Convention. And indeed, the only limitation, the only precise limitation that the Law of the Sea Convention makes on this point is that it says that when a submarine is within the territorial sea of another state, it needs to navigate on the surface. Now, it needs to be observed that China, and indeed there's 169 states that are parties to the Law of the Sea Convention, and even the United States, which is not a party to the convention, accepts and asserts all of the fundamental elements of the convention. And of course, the United States is actively seeking to engage in what are called freedom of navigation operations throughout the South China Sea, in which, even though the United States is not a party to the Law of the Sea Convention, it consistently asserts rights that it believes that the US Navy and US warships and US flagged vessels generally can seek to assert consistently with the convention in waters globally. And of course, we know that there are tensions between China and the United States in terms of the way that China undertakes and engages in some of those activities. So my concluding point in terms of this basic issue of navigation is that AUKUS, as I said, is framed upon the exercise of the freedom of navigation. AUKUS submarines will not be operating in the territorial sea. They will be stealthily operating within the exclusive economic zone and beyond the 200 nautical mile mark, seeking to observe, surveil, monitor the activities of other navies in multiple different settings. So given that we're looking at a fairly long timeline for the development of AUKUS submarines, given that we currently have a track record of China constantly challenging and pushing back and asserting contrary positions to what a traditional interpretation of the Law of the Sea Convention might say in terms of the navigational rights and freedoms of foreign military vessels, is there an issue here in terms of the fundamental legal basis of AUKUS that could be questioned into the future? And I need to observe that I acknowledge and at one level applaud the fact that we have a Prime Minister, we have a Foreign Minister, we have a Defence Minister who at least speak the language of the law of the sea. I can't really recall a Prime Minister who has referenced the Law of the Sea Convention so frequently as Prime Minister Albanese, and he's done so in the context of AUKUS to a degree, but also in terms of Australia's position in terms of matters with respect to the South China Sea in particular, and it's come up recently in terms of the events just of the last week, and also the events that arose late last year in the Sea of Japan concerning the HMAS Toowoomba. So it's terrific that we've got ministers at such a senior level who talk the talk of international law. As an international lawyer, I find that very reassuring, and are clearly aware of the relevant international legal framework, the Constitution of the Oceans that applies in this area. But I think they also have an awareness that China's interpretations of a number of aspects of the convention are challenging how these interpretations might be seen into the future. So that's my first legal analysis of a key aspect of AUKUS. The second dimension I want to discuss this evening is this. Many of you will have a clear understanding and appreciation of the fairly consistent position that Australian governments have adopted towards nuclear weapons. And that, by and large, has been a fairly strong bipartisan position over many decades. And it's probably fair to say that Labor governments in particular have been strongly associated with promoting an anti-nuclear position and have sought to cooperate at a diplomatic and a legal level in multiple different settings, seeking to ensure that there's no proliferation of nuclear weapons, that there are constraints placed on nuclear weapons, and indeed, arguably, one of the legacies of the Hawke government was the promotion, along with New Zealand and Pacific Island states, of the South Pacific Nuclear Free Zone Treaty, which eventually resulted in the Treaty of Rarotonga in 1985. Now, it's fair to say that this treaty is a fairly low-profile treaty, but it's one that's generated some interest in recent times directly as a result of AUKUS. And that's partly due to the fact that the Albanese government came to office with a clear view within the Labor Party that there needed to be an active engagement with Pacific Island neighbours on multiple different areas. They obviously took a view that there'd been a neglect in terms of the way in which the coalition government had sought to engage with the Pacific on a range of questions. Obviously, sea level rise, climate change were major drivers of that. But as soon as AUKUS was announced, there was a concern raised within the Pacific as to whether or not this was going to reflect a significant change from a policy perspective within Australia with respect to the acquisition not only of nuclear-powered submarines, but also whether this could be the thin edge of the wedge in terms of ultimately Australia acquiring some greater nuclear capability. So the history of a nuclear-free South Pacific is one in which we can track the development of that movement, partly arising as a result of the protests and concerns within the region arising from nuclear testing within the region, conducted by a number of states, but which France in particular became a major focal point of that attention. So this is the limits of the South Pacific nuclear-free zone, and you can see that it really encompasses all of the Southwest Pacific. It extends as far south as the Antarctic Treaty Area, so it goes as far south as 60 degrees south. It encompasses all of New Zealand. It encompasses the continent of Australia, and most importantly for us here, it encompasses Tasmania. So the South Pacific nuclear-free zone was an example of a number of nuclear-free zones that had been developed and declared, really starting from the development with the Antarctic Treaty, effectively making Antarctica nuclear-free. And so there's a number of these declared nuclear-free zones that exist around the world. For current purposes, this is the zone which we're interested in, and we need to be aware of what the South Pacific Nuclear-Free Zone Treaty says. So its principal obligation is that the states that are parties to the Treaty of Rarotonga agree to not acquire nuclear weapons and not to engage in any testing of nuclear weapons within the region. Those are the principal obligations, and there's one really important exception that's built into the Treaty of Rarotonga, and that is that it does not impair the navigational rights and freedoms of nuclear-armed or nuclear-powered vessels. So it doesn't address navigational rights of nuclear warships, and that would include, of course, nuclear submarines. You can see that all of the parties to the treaty include all of the relevant states within the region, and of course, as I said, Australia and New Zealand. There was, of course, a bit of an issue here in terms of engaging those members of the region who had territories and who had a nuclear history, and obviously France's conduct came into sharp relief in relation to its ongoing nuclear weapons testing program in French Polynesia and ultimately in Mururoa Atoll. When France decided to bring a halt to that nuclear weapons testing program, it then signed on and became a party to the treaty also. So at one level, the treaty has been seen as a great success, and as a result of the cessation of French nuclear testing within the region, the whole issue of the South Pacific being a nuclear-free zone has been, if you like, acknowledged, accepted, and it's become really a dormant issue until the last 12 to 18 months. Now, as I said, the Treaty of Rarotonga applying to the South Pacific is not the only region in which we have such zones. We have an adjoining zone in Southeast Asia, which basically mirrors key aspects of the South Pacific Nuclear-Free Zone Treaty in that it prohibits the regional states who, as you can see, are predominantly the ASEAN states, with Papua New Guinea also included in terms of their acquisition of nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons testing. But the Treaty of Bangkok, as it's also known as, also allows for the movement of nuclear-powered and nuclear-armed vessels throughout the region. And of course, that was particularly important given the significant United States presence within the region as a security guarantor to a number of those states, and in particular the Philippines at the time that the treaty was concluded. So once AUKUS was announced, there was an immediate response from a number of South Pacific states in terms of the way in which AUKUS was being perceived by Australia's immediate neighbours and Australia's regional neighbours. And we saw those challenges coming broadly from within the South Pacific, in terms of the so-called Pacific family. And in particular, they were raising concerns and had questions as to whether or not Australia's commitment to AUKUS was really seeing Australia revisiting its anti-nuclear position that had been indelibly articulated and advanced and confirmed through the position of the Treaty of Rarotonga, and which seemingly, at least for the Pacific family, had strong bipartisan support until AUKUS came along. We, of course, had reactions from China, who was critical of AUKUS and sought to undermine the legitimacy of the approach and sought to push back against why Australia would be seeking to acquire these nuclear-powered submarines. We had, as I said, the Quad, which was also seen as supplementary and supportive of this type of initiative in terms of India and Japan, in addition to Australia and the United States. We had the Philippines raising concerns, and then Filipino President Duarte was quite critical of aspects of AUKUS. President Marcos, the current Filipino president, has not been quite as fierce in terms of their criticism and commentary. So my general point is that AUKUS unravelled some of the strategic settings and perhaps the confidence in Australia's anti-nuclear position within the region. So I think it's fair to say that when the Albanese government came to office, not only did they see that they had a repair job in terms of repairing Pacific relations, and we all know that Foreign Minister Wong devoted quite a lot of time in the first 12 to 18 months in office in terms of literally engaging in shuttle diplomacy in and out of the region, visiting multiple South Pacific states to reassure them of Australia's engagement and commitment within the region. But a common aspect of many of those bilateral discussions was clearly matters associated with AUKUS. And so in addition to the broad legal issues I've been speaking about in terms of law of the sea, freedom of navigation, and also the Treaty of Rarotonga, there was another concern being raised, and that was whether Australia's acquisition of nuclear-powered submarines could somehow be seen as raising Australia's commitment to the NPT, which of course Australia at a bipartisan level has been a very strong supporter of for many decades, and which has been a pillar, if you like, of Australia's non-proliferation policy and diplomacy and legal approach. So we get this statement from the Foreign Minister in January last year, acknowledging the 50th anniversary of Australia signing on to the NPT and just restating that Australia remains committed and engaged in the NPT. We then get the Foreign Minister a little later last year going to New Caledonia and directly addressing this point in terms of Australia's recommitment to the NPT, but also talking about Australia's ongoing commitment to the Treaty of Rarotonga. We then, perhaps absolutely remarkably, get the Pacific Islands Forum meeting occurring last year. And where does that meeting occur? It occurs in the Cook Islands. It occurs in Rarotonga. So not surprisingly, the whole question of Australia's commitment to the Treaty of Rarotonga comes up at that meeting. And I didn't attend the meeting. All I can go on is media reports, but clearly the Australian media reported that there were some delicate negotiations that needed to be undertaken to ensure that the final communique issued by the PIF was consistent with an understanding that Australia remained committed to the Treaty of Rarotonga. Australia was not seeking to acquire nuclear weapons, and that Australia's position was that the acquisition of nuclear-powered submarines was entirely consistent with what it saw as its position under the Treaty of Rarotonga. And indeed, it needs to be acknowledged that there was some media reporting that some Pacific Island states were seeking to even suggest that the Treaty of Rarotonga should be renegotiated to expand its scope to actually place limitations on member states acquiring nuclear-powered vessels, which would have clearly extended to Australia's acquisition of nuclear-powered submarines. So that very challenging diplomatic discourse seemed to be headed off, whether it was by deft Australian diplomacy or the Prime Minister's charm, I really cannot observe. But the issue appeared to have been neutralised by the end of that PIF meeting at the end of 2023. But that doesn't mean to say that it won't resurface into the future. So, Bruno, I'm just going to make my concluding remarks and then really welcome questions and discussion. So I think what we can say is that, and I haven't really perhaps picked up on this enough, but from my earlier observations, nuclear-powered, I emphasise nuclear-powered, let alone nuclear-armed, nuclear-powered submarines exist. They currently operate within the waters of East Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Indo-Pacific more widely. The United States is clearly operating these vessels on a very regular basis, and China has nuclear-powered submarines. They will be operating those vessels within their own waters. So that needs to be accepted as a given. And so I find somewhat curious the backlash and the critical response from some of Australia's ASEAN neighbours. It's as if they don't even recognise that these submarines are currently operating within their region. The submarines enjoy the freedom of navigation. That's the foundation upon which they exist. It's the foundation upon which they operate. It's the foundation upon which the major Western states ultimately agreed to the so-called package deal of the 1982 UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. Without this guarantee of the freedom of navigation, the ability of states to be able to assert these much more expansive maritime zones would not have been acceptable for the major Western maritime nations, including the United States, even though it's not a party to the convention. So that's a given. But as I've indicated to you, we are seeing some erosion of aspects of the freedom of navigation, and the phenomena that we talked about there, that international lawyers and other scholars talk about, is the notion of creeping jurisdiction, that states are gradually extending their jurisdiction further beyond their coastlines in ways that are not consistent or contemplated under the convention. So what might the response be to this? Well, there's a range of possible legal responses that could arise, but I think that ultimately my message is that there's a lot more diplomacy that's required in terms of Australia and successive Australian governments, because this is a long-term project that they will need to continue to engage with in terms of not only Pacific neighbours, but also Southeast Asian and ASEAN neighbours, to seek to reassure them in terms of what Australia's position will be on this matter. But the timelines are significant. They will be drawn out over a number of decades. And so we could probably reconvene in a few years' time to talk about the latest AUKUS issues that sit within this particular framework, because there are a number of ongoing legal questions in addition to all of the strategic, diplomatic and other questions arising from AUKUS. So thank you for the opportunity to speak to you this evening, and I'll look forward to some questions, Bruno.
Thank you very much, Don, for that very interesting presentation. So yes, Q&A, who would like to start? So, well, first I would like you to introduce yourself, especially for our online audience, and your question.
My name's Peter Davson-Galley. I'm a philosopher, not a lawyer. I do have an interest in this sort of stuff. One thing that strikes me as crucial grey zone is what submarine, whether nuclear or not, and what, for that matter, any military vessel like Hobart, whether nuclear or nuclear powered or not, happens to be doing outside the tight 13 nautical miles or whatever the hell it is, in, say, an economic zone or a zone of notification of military presence, fine for it to just sort of whoosh through. And I'd be curious to know if there's any move afoot in the relevant international law setting arenas to work out what might be legitimate constraints to be placed upon of the sort that China wants, though it itself transgresses them elsewhere, like the South China Sea, but never mind. What constraints might be legitimately agreed upon on what a military vessel can do so close to shore, so to speak? Well, it's not all that close. It's close enough to be irritating.
Thank you for that question, and I think it's an entirely reasonable question to pose. And I think perhaps a good illustration of the point that you're making is that, of course, we know that within Australia, in both 2021 and 2023, during Australia's conduct of Operation Talisman Sabre, which is the joint military operations that Australia conducts alongside other foreign militaries off the Queensland coastline, those operations have been closely observed by Chinese intelligence vessels that have been dispatched to sail within the Australian exclusive economic zone, precisely to undertake monitoring and surveillance of those activities. Now, those Chinese intelligence vessels, which intentionally stay outside of the Australian territorial sea, are quite clearly there to engage, as I said, in monitoring, surveillance and observation of the way in which Australia and other foreign navies are conducting themselves. We shouldn't necessarily be flattered, because this is not an uncommon practice that China has adopted in terms of observing US-led naval exercises off the US coast. So the position of Australia and the United States and other major Western powers is that what China is doing is entirely legitimate with the freedom of navigation, and so no attempt is made to interfere with those particular Chinese activities. Of course, they're very closely observed, but providing that China is operating outside of the 12 nautical mile zone, the position is that that's entirely consistent with the law of the sea. But I guess the core question you're asking is, well, what is the sort of legitimate business of a foreign navy within these various different maritime zones? Now, of course, they can be there by invitation to undertake a joint patrol. And so we've got examples at the moment where Australia is being invited by the Philippines to assist the Philippines in joint patrols within the Philippines exclusive economic zone. So that's not exceptional. Militaries are invited to engage in those activities all the time. Of course, a naval vessel can be repositioning from one part of the world to the other. That also is not exceptional. A foreign military vessel might be undertaking a port visit in another locality. Of course, naval vessels can be undertaking legitimate patrols around their exclusive economic zone and associated related areas. But I guess the critical issue is that submarines are not necessarily the sort of vessels that are really designed for those types of activities. Submarines are very specifically designed not only as warfighting naval vessels, but also to engage in surveillance, monitoring, observation at various levels, which other vessels cannot just undertake. So I guess the critical question that you're raising, especially from your discipline perspective, is how can we legitimately say that a submarine is passively engaging in these types of activities within the exclusive economic zone of various states, especially given that in most instances there'll be very little understanding that these types of submarines are even there.
The other part of my question, which you haven't addressed, I'd like you to, is there discussion in the relevant arenas that set international law, sort of grey zone stuff?
Thank you for reminding me about that. So I think the answer is no, there's not. It doesn't mean to say that militaries are not reaching agreement on codes of conduct in terms of how they should interact with respect to unexplained encounters in various different settings. And indeed, China has been part of some of those active discussions, which has been led in East Asia and Southeast Asia. But I think on the basis of the sort of actions and responses that we've been seeing in recent times off the Chinese coastline, those initiatives are not having much impact. Richard.
Yes, Don. Well, you know, Richard, I'm with the law school here now. Just an observation more on SpinFiz, the South Pacific one, more a comment than anything else. One of the things that could help Australia with the AUKUS issue in the Pacific Islands is to persuade our American allies to actually sign the protocols to the SpinFiz. And if anybody notices the states that you put up who are signatories to the agreement, 3 American territories, former territories, Palau, FSM, and Marshall Islands have not signed on. So in fact, the regional commitment to the SpinFiz agreement is not entirely complete, even within the forum. And the fact that the US, China, and Russia, or Soviet Union it was at the time, were quick to sign on, the US is not, and that continues to be a source of suspicion and irritation for Australia and our Pacific Island neighbors, that this sort of reinforces the concern as to why they won't sign on to an agreement that the region itself endorses and that Australia proposed. It's just an observation, Don.
I think it's a very apt observation. Thank you, Richard.
Yeah, I think I can probably go my question. I think you need to be out by 7. Apparently, there's another group coming in, so we might have to finish up very soon. I just want to comment on Australia's relationship with nuclear weapons. I just make the comment that it's a bit more ambiguous than we sometimes think, in the sense that up until the Whitlam government, it was Australian policy to develop our own sovereign nuclear weapons, and we were doing that with the British, with Woomera tests and whatnot. We joined the Non-Proliferation Treaty. In return for that, we gave up those ambitions, but we also went under the protection of the American Extended Nuclear Deterrent. So on one view every day, we rely upon nuclear weapons for our security, and that's not something that we acknowledge that often. So that's more of a comment on we've got a response to that.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeff.
My question is very naive, purely as a citizen. I find it, one of the planks of this is the undetectability of the submarines. I find it impossible to believe that in the next 10 or 20 years, technology will not advance so that they will be detectable. How much serious discussion is going into that?
Look, I think that's an interesting observation. I can't comment on that because it's well beyond my discipline expertise, but I think it's not an unlikely scenario in which we might well find that the stealth capability of these submarines might well become somewhat exposed.
Just a very quick one, hypothetical. If Trump does get in, is there a risk that AUKUS could collapse?
Oh, most definitely. And I think that that's a risk that's being actively considered at the moment. And so, you know, we know how President Trump reacted to the refugee resettlement deal that Malcolm Turnbull had agreed with President Obama. That was once again actively highlighted by discussions in the ABC documentary Nemesis. So yes, it's entirely possible that a Trump administration might take the view, generally speaking, America first means that America gets the submarines first, Australia gets them, Australia is the second or third priority. But I guess the sort of fallback on that is that AUKUS is a very long-term project. And so if it's disrupted for 4 years under a Trump administration, that doesn't necessarily sink the whole deal. given that there are other aspects in place that could possibly be worked around.
Professor Rothwell, thanks so much for your presentation. You spoke about the stretching of the law of the sea, especially by China, and it seems that there has been a trend, at least in the last 20 years, of great powers stretching various forms of the law. And I think about the US and the Jus ad bellum. I think about the Israeli Defense Forces at the moment and their various sort of reinterpretations and stretching. Is this an issue with respects to when we talk about the foundational nature of international law and we talk about a rules-based order? Is this stretching something we should expect? Is this stretching by great powers problematic? Is this the norm?
Thank you for that question. And I guess you're right. It's not exceptional. It's not extraordinary that the great powers especially seek to take very liberal interpretations of aspects of international law, whilst also seeking to justify their actions consistently with international law, which China does on a fairly regular basis, and which even Vladimir Putin has done in terms of seeking to justify his military intervention in Ukraine, which comes back to what is the role for a middle power like Australia in these processes? At an earlier session today that Jeff McGee kindly convened here at the law school, we were talking about the case before the International Court of Justice between Ukraine and Russia. And we spoke about the fact that Australia had intervened in the International Court of Justice to support the Ukrainian position there. So whilst Australia may not always be a party to some of these disputes or disputations or disagreements, Australia does actually have a role to play. And we need to be mindful of the fact that Australia as a middle power, and hopefully a respected middle power, can play an active legal role in seeking to ensure that the stretching, as you describe it, doesn't go well beyond the boundaries. And so to that end, even though I have some difficulties at times with the language, I find it really reassuring that both the previous government and the current government constantly have referenced some of these core fundamental rules of international law in terms of some of these debates and discourses that we've been talking about this evening.
All right, thank you, Don. So we are running out of time, so thank you all for joining us today. Please, again, let's give another round of applause.